And this is why, again, as OSI, we are a signatory of UNPSI. We have also signatory to the Nairobi Declaration, which is basically looking at the impacts of climate change and what can we do, what's our role as insurance in ensuring that we encourage the communities where we are living in to mitigate against such risks. Our experience with the global risks that we're experiencing has convinced us that it is only through multi-stakeholder cooperation that we can truly accelerate progress and reduce the risks so that we can create sustainable businesses for future generations. Therefore, this webinar will discuss the following topics: catastrophic risk modeling and reinsurance pricing, riot and political risk reinsurance exposure, and lastly, the emerging insurance risk from COVID-19 in 2021 and beyond. We have partnered with Munich Re and Tropical Re to bring this webinar to you. These agendas are important. It is also a vast one, and we do acknowledge that the time available for this webinar is indeed limited. So your participation during the presentations will assist all of us in coming up with ideas and solutions to the challenges that the industry is facing. Ladies and gentlemen, we believe as OSI that by participating in this webinar, we are in the right place and the right time. Together, we can accelerate the exchange of ideas and scale up best practices for the good of our business, the industry, and more importantly, our clients who really depend on us to provide solutions for them. I am pleased on behalf of OSI Secretariat that indeed we do have a number of executives, managers, and staff in this webinar. And what this will do is that it will provide us with different and multifaceted viewpoints to the discussions to be carried out over the next 2 days. I'm confident that you will find great ideas here, fresh energy in your quest to create more innovative, responsive, and client-centered reinsurance and insurance companies. We want to thank Munich Re and Tropical Re speakers who truly have taken their time to not only research, but also prepare and share with us the experience that they have garnered for the years, for the next 2 days. We remain indebted to you, and definitely we cannot be able to pay you monetarily for the time and effort you're putting into this. Lastly, I would like to just mention a few housekeeping rules. The speaker at the beginning, they are going to guide us on how they would like to run the session. But we are requesting that you all stay muted. You will note that the kind of format that we have opted for is the one that enables you to see who the participants are as a participant. So you can actually see who has joined. And this has been deliberate because in the past we have had people telling us that they really want to know who is in their session. So in light of that, please mute, and if you'd like to speak, you can raise up your hand or you can type in your questions. There will be a Q&A session. I wish you all a very successful webinar, and I look forward to seeing you in our next event. We're going to have the OSI quiz very soon, and we're also going to have the OSI conference in the beautiful coastal city of Zanzibar, and I hope to see you physically there. Have a good day. And at this point, I would like to request Maureen to pop up the program. Thank you. So we're now starting on the next session. And our session here will be looking at catastrophic risk modeling and reinsurance pricing. And we will be taken through by Mr. Claus. Allow me to just introduce him using one name. The second name is a bit difficult, but so I will not do justice to it. So Mr. Claus works for Munich Re. He joined in 1998. His background is mathematics, a qualified actuary, and currently working as a senior underwriter for property treaty at Munich Re of Africa. He started his career in the reserving unit and worked for many years in the actuarial department. And you can see he has gained quite tremendous experience, and not only in African markets, but also Japan, India, Australia, and Korea. So he will be giving us a holistic approach as he takes us through the session. Mr. Klaus, in Kenya, we say karibu. In French, we say bienvenue. In English, we say welcome. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Yeah, okay, perfect. Thank you very much, Rose, for this introduction and for this nice words. So, and of course, good morning to everyone. I hope you have already a good start into the day, and welcome to today's reinsurance webinar for cat modeling and reinsurance pricing. I will share now my screen. And I think we will discuss the individual topics about cat modeling and reinsurance pricing. And I propose that we will discuss the questions you have. You can write this down into the chat, and we should discuss this after the session. Timing-wise, I assume we will take 1 hour for the presentation, and afterwards we have still sufficient time to go into details of the questions. So our topic today is nat cat modeling and reinsurance pricing, or I should rather say nat cat reinsurance pricing, because reinsurance pricing in general would rather go beyond the scope of today's sessions. So nat cat modeling is of course quite an important topic in insurance and reinsurance, due to the fact that severe nat cat losses are one of the main drivers of the negative performance of an insurance or a reinsurance company. And for example, if you check historical results of the insurance companies, you will see that worst performing years are linked in most cases with observed severe nat cat events. And I think this makes the qualitative and proper risk assessment of nat cat exposure for the insurance sector so important. I split today's session into 2 parts. In the first step, I would like to talk about the basic principle of setting up a nat cat model. And I will do this on a quite basic level. Here I will give you a more rough overview about how the models are created in general. And in the second part of the session, I will focus on reinsurance pricing for cat exposure. I will discuss the typical reinsurance pricing methods, and which are commonly used in reinsurance pricing. And by the way, I cannot promise that the session will be less technical, but I will try to keep it as simple as possible, and I will also try to avoid formulas where possible. So coming now to the first part, cat modeling. Before we start, I would like to give you some basic statements about the term cat. The term cat is linked to nat cat and man-made losses. The name nat cat means all events which are related to the common known natural catastrophes like earthquake, cyclone, hail. But we have also on the other hand, we have man-made events, which falls under the category cat events. However, these events are rather caused by humans being failure and not by force of nature. Typical examples are the explosions like in Tianjin. We have one loss in China in 2015, or in Beirut in Lebanon 2 years ago, which led to severe losses across a certain region. But those losses, yeah. Mm-hmm.
We cannot see your screen.
Oh, sorry. Mm-hmm. Thank you for interrupting. Now it's better?
Nothing yet.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, now we can see the screen.
Okay, sorry for that.
It's good now, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Which I think we discussed the terminology not cut versus man-made, and I think I was referring to two man-made losses which were occurred in Tianjin in China in 2015 and in Beirut in Lebanon. But also, for example, like events we saw in South Africa, unfortunately, with the riots in 2021, falls under the category of man-made events. But let's start now with cut loss modeling. The first general question I would like to start is, why is cut modeling essential for doing insurance business? And one of the core reasons is the solvency related issue for an insurance company. Cut events could impact the solvency of an insurance company significantly and could lead to insolvency of the company in the worst case. I put here an example just to show you the situation. We assume we have a startup company, an insurance startup company, which started its operation in 2018. And the company earns 100 billion each year from their insureds. Then over 4 years, they collected 400 billion. Now, in the situation that you will see a cut event, or a cut event will occur in 2021 with 600 billion, you see here from the graph that you are immediately in the loss position. And I think this makes the cut modeling so important. I think you have to come up with a proper risk assessment to avoid such situations. And of course, this is just a simplified example, and many factors are neglected, such as normal basic losses, but it shows just simple the impact of big not cut events here. And I like this example because it motivates the importance of having first the risk capital, for example, or alternatively having a proper reinsurance, for example, in order to avoid such situations that you come directly in an insolvency situation. So who is doing in general the cut modeling? I split this into two parts or two sections, what we see in the markets. So I think on the one hand side, we have the insurance business sector who is dealing with cut modeling. Here we have individual consultants. The insurance and reinsurance companies, of course, are doing cut modeling, but last but not least, also the brokers. On the other side, we have science and public section. Here, the Geological Survey and Public Agency we have in this group, and of course, the scientific groups and universities. And these two groups, of course, collaborate together in many projects and have a quite detailed exchange about cut modeling. We will start now with the basic principles of not cut modeling. So I think when you start to read documents about not cut modeling, you will be always confronted with the definition of the term risk. In literature, you can find different definition of the term risk, but in insurance, you will find more or less following definition, which is the most common used one. So the defined risk function can be explained in the insurance sector via three components. The first one is hazard here, which contains the individual perils like earthquake, hail, or flood. And the hazard determines the occurrence probability of a certain size of an event. The second element here is the vulnerability of the risk, which determines the probability of a certain size of an event. And for example, if we look to the individual components, for example, like buildings or contents of buildings or business interruption, then we see that each component will have a different behavior in respect of damage probability for certain perils. For example, if you look to concrete buildings, they might have different risk of damage than wooden buildings. And finally, we have here the third component, which is the exposure. And if you have evaluated all three components, then and combine all components, the risk gives you finally the premium which has to be charged to cover not cut events of one risks. So in the following sections, you will always get in touch with these three elements. And I think the next slide gives you also a short summary of those components. So you have again here the hazard information, where the scientific input plays quite an important role. Then you have here the vulnerability function, which determines the probability of damage for certain type of risks. And in most cases, this is derived from statistical information, but also expertise of engineers are considered in this assessment. Together with the exposure values here on the bottom, you get finally a set of scenarios here, and which gives you then finally the result of the so-called risk curve, or we are saying later also PMO curve, and PMO curve stands more for probable maximum loss curve. So we would like to go now into the detailed explanation of the three core elements: hazard, vulnerability, and exposed values. And I would like to start here with hazard. The first important characteristic of the term hazard is the peril itself. So in general, we talk about the standard perils like earthquake, tropical storm, storm surge, river flooding, landslides, tsunamis, hail, flash flood, tornadoes, or volcanic eruption. So these are the most common perils. And of course, the hazard is strongly dependent on the location of these risks. As everyone knows, not all locations are exposed to perils in the same way. So in general, models requires different granularity of location information, but in most cases, we can say the more granular location information is, the better the quality of the model is. So highest granular information is the address information here. If we get, for example, CRESTR or SIP information, then we are talking more on about a rough not-caught model. But CRESTR, for example, maybe this is also important to know, is one of the most standardized format for accumulation risk data for natural hazards. So, and I think many models are using CRESTR information, especially if you have no detailed information like address information. And therefore, I think there are many markets which are still using quite rough models here. In addition, on the right-hand side, we have the local factors, which plays quite an important role for the intensity of an event. For example, subsoil conditions or slope, land use, or the distance to the coast, but also dikes or elevation of above the water body are only some factors which has to be considered in the risk calculation. One example is, of course, a soil condition for earthquake, for example. Earthquakes in regions with sandy soil condition will impact the area more severe, of course, than regions with a kind of rocky soil condition. And I think finally, all information, it's also important for the hazard assessment, which are available, can be used to evaluate the hazard of your location. Typical examples are here world map of natural hazards. I think I will show you then in a few minutes a kind of risk map here. And NatCat services, you can use internet or also some local systems like we have in Germany for the flood risk zones, but also tariff zones and local authorities can be used here. I have here an example for this hazard component, and I think this slide gives you just a flavor about how you could assess the hazard of your location. This is a so-called hazard map, and this can provide you detailed information about the hazard of your location. We see here the earthquake hazard map of Uganda and Kenya, for example. It's a quite colorful map, as you can see. So the dark red areas, for example, show the regions with the highest intensity of a possible earthquake. And on the right-hand table, you see here a kind of agenda or legend for this kind of risks. So, for example, if you look to the red zone, this corresponds to the so-called Mercalli intensity of scale 8. And the question is, what does this mean? Well, I think if you go into Wikipedia, for example, then you see just some general statements. For example, that this means that we expect slight damages in specially designed structures. We see considerable damages in ordinary substantial buildings, and we see great damages in poorly built structures. This is more or less the synonym for this intensity here. Here is also one screenshot for the earthquake map of South Africa. And we will see later on how we use this then in a calculation example, how we can use the hazard map then. Coming now to the second section, which is vulnerability. So the vulnerability characteristic is responsible for the damage potential of a risk in case of an event. First of all, we separate between risks of residential, commercial, industrial risks, or even more specific risks like petrochemical or food industry, or loss of profits, for example. Building characteristics could also influence the probability of severe damages, such as construction types or construction material like wood or steel, what you use for building a house. Furthermore, the age of the building, of course, the roof or the height and maintenance of the buildings plays quite an important role for the vulnerability of the risks. And finally, we have here on the right-hand side, we have some prevention measurements, for example, mobile walls or storm shutters, who could reduce also the risk in respect of the vulnerability here. I plotted here or present here a graph which shows the different vulnerability curves for individual occupancy types. So the green one is, for example, the vulnerability curve for industrial segment. The red one is for commercial, and the blue one is for residential business. So you see here on the x-axis the intensity of the earthquake, and on the y-axis the damage ratio. Which means, of course, the higher the intensity of the earthquake is, the higher the damage ratio you will expect, for example. And I think this is more based on scientific expertise and knowledge. And of course, they are using also here statistical data from also other countries or under other countries and markets to come up with here a certain connection between the intensity of the earthquake and the damage ratio. Last but not least, we come to the third element, here, which is the exposure. From the perspective of the owner of the risks, the exposure is more or less the total value of the risk. However, in insurance or reinsurance, there are different features which changes the view on the exposure. So amount-wise, for example, integration of deductibles or limits could change the exposure for the insurance or reinsurance companies. But we have also features like the hours clause, for example, which you can find here, which could reduce the exposure for not-cat events. So the hours clause in reinsurance contracts, for example, defines the duration of the event in which the risk can be covered under one event. For example, if you have agreed on a 168 hours clause for earthquake, this means that all losses occurring within this 168 hours are covered within one event. So I have here again the hazard map, but included here now some exposure values. This is a value distribution of all power plants in Uganda and Kenya. And I think it's quite interesting because this can then at the end also quite well used for monitoring your accumulation potential of your company, for example. And it gives you always a good overview how your risks are distributed over the countries here. Same I have here for South Africa. Yeah. So the last slide in respect of risk, and we are still within these three components: hazard, vulnerability, and exposure, as you can see. So the last slide here summarizes the process of risk assessment in a quick and good manner based on 4 questions. So first question is, what is the peril of the covered risks, e.g. earthquake or wind? Then the second question, and I think here you need more the scientific knowledge, what is the vulnerability of your risks? And what is the damage ratio of your risks? And finally, the third question is here, which is important to know, where are the total sum insured located? And to come then finally to the financial aspect, you have to consider the insurance and reinsurance conditions, like, for example, deductibles and limits, to have then the financial view on your risk. So this was a quite intensive part of theory. I would like to give you here now an example how you come up finally with the premium for individual peril. So I think I mentioned before that the calculation of the risk is equal to the expected loss on the other side, and which is required to cover those risks. So in the first step, the hazard level for the specific location has to be evaluated. And according to scientific knowledge, a specific return period can be assigned to the defined hazard level. After that, local aspects like soil condition has to be considered depending on the availability of this kind of information. And these site conditions is a kind of modifier for the hazard level, which has to be taken into account into the evaluation process. And based on this information, other hazard levels and its corresponding return period are derived, which could occur also in the relevant location. We will put this now into concrete figures. And I took here one example from Kenya. So the example should show us now how to come up with a certain risk in Nakuru, in Kenya, in respect of earthquake. So we see on the left-hand side here the map with Nakuru, and on the right-hand side there is already this orange-yellow hazard map with the earthquake risk for Kenya here. So according to our hazard map here, we have a basic hazard level. The intensity is 7 according to the Mercalli intensity. Then you have to consider certain local factors like soil condition, amplification and liquefaction are here the key terms more or less. And based on that, you can modify the intensity 7. And if you came up then with a kind of return period of this hazard level, which is here 500, then or initiating from this level, you come up with the other return periods for the different hazard levels. For example, with intensity 6, you have a return period of 125. For 8, you have 1,500, and for the intensity 9, you have 1,500. And you see, in general, you have always a factor 3 or 4 between the individual Mercalli intensities, and this can be used as a general, I guess, more or less for the different return periods. So as a next step, we'll determine the vulnerability of the risks. Here, detailed knowledge of the located risk is necessary in order to come up with a qualitative vulnerability assessment. First, a damage ratio is determined for the corresponding hazard intensity. And this is mainly driven by statistical information, which can be taken from risks all over the world with similar characteristics in respect of the hazard intensity and risk occupancy. So again, here some figures. So for the intensity of 6, we have here the scientific expertise that we expect 0.4% of the sum insured is the loss ratio. For the intensity 7, we have 2% of the sum insured is the loss ratio. And for the intensity 8, we have the loss ratio of 7%, and finally 15% for the Mercalli intensity 9. Now you have, of course, as I mentioned before, you have other factors which could influence the vulnerability. And I put here just, for example, the age of the factory. If it has if it's quite old, the factory, then I think you have to consider this and increase your vulnerability of your damage ratio. Here we use the factor 1.3, and 1.3 times the damage ratio we have here on this basic table, we come up with 0.5% for the Mercalli intensity of 6, then 2.6, 9.1, and then 19.5% for the highest exposure here. So we are already at the level that we can then finally calculate the expected loss for each hazard level. And this is finally done if you then sum up all losses and weight this with the return period. So we have now this table. So what I presented before, we had the return period to the intensity, and we have a certain damage ratio related to this intensity. And if you sum up all damage ratios weighted by 1 divided by the return period, then you get your final premium, which is here 0.96 per mil, for example, for this risk in Nakuru. So maybe just to give you some background about this 1 divided by 125, which is the return period. So in general, your damage ratio is 0.5%. And if you would like to earn back this 0.5% in 125 years, for example, so you have to divide this by this return period to earn in 125 years back the 0.5% damage ratio. And I think this is just the basic principle of for calculation of premium, for reinsurance premium or also insurance premium. So I think I prepared just two slides again for two other perils. The first example is related to hail. You have here a simulated hail track close to Joburg, and you have to estimate here the number of insured cars affected by the hail track. Then based on that, the average damage ratio per car is estimated based on loss experience with a comparable hail intensity. And finally, a return period has to be assigned to this event, which can be based either on statistical information or based on scientific expertise. But in general, I think to come up with a certain return period of a certain loss event, I think it's in most cases a combination between statistical information and the expertise of scientists. For flood, the assessment is based on the so-called flood maps. So we showed before the hazard maps, but there are also, of course, for other perils, hazard maps like flood, which describes, for example, here the different hazard level around the river system. We have here an example based on a German flood map. The individual hazard maps are split into 4 zones here. Zone 1 is very low hazard with a return period of about 200 years. Zone 2 is low hazard with a return period of 50 to 200 years. And Zone 3 with medium hazard, which is equal to return period of 10 to 50 years. And finally, high hazard with a return period of at least once in 10 years. So, and you see already, I think statistical information maybe can be used for the first 2 items here, or for the highest hazard here. But if we talk about 200 years event, it might be quite scarce to have here sufficient loss information, of course. So we have now all knowledge to create a PML curve, which can be applied to the risk assessment. And we will now show you the basic principle of a PML curve. I think we will start with following requirement that after a certain time, the sum of the premium should be equal to the sum of the expected loss. So this is more or less the basic principle of insurance. So what does this mean? For example, if we expect a loss of amount A, this is quite a general term here now, and we expect this loss in a number of years B, then you need A divided B, a premium, to balance this out. What does this mean in figures? I think it's much easier here. So if we expect a loss of $1 million, which is expected to occur once in 100 years, then at the end, you need $10,000 annual premium to cover this exposure and this risk. And I think you can directly derive then the formula, the risk is the loss times the probability, more or less. So the question is coming up now, what is about the other return period? So we maybe have calculated this point. This is 100 years return period, and you have this loss amount. But what is happening with the other ones? So at the end, we should expect a curve like this, which is called a PML curve, probable maximum loss curve. This means to all loss amounts, a certain return period should be assigned to. And I think this is just now a snapshot. This can be achieved in simulating thousands events, which can be seen on this slide on the left-hand side. And each event has a certain loss size. And if you now sort the losses and accumulate the probabilities, you will come up automatically with a kind of PMO curve. And I think the final result is more or less than here, the PMO curve. This is just a graphical overview. And I have here also one result of a PMO curve with the corresponding return period table. So in this example, we have a loss of 35.7 million or higher every 10 years. Then a loss of 73.1 million every 25 years or higher, and so on. And in the average, we expect then a loss of approximately 230 million. And I think this model is then at the end used for doing, for example, reinsurance pricing for the exposure method. But I will come later on to this point. Here, this is just one slide to and an add-on to the mentioned simulation process, in just to give you some idea how a simulation could look like. I think we have on the top the location information here. We have here the corresponding exposure information of a country. And I think this example is linked to the US. And these are historical storm tracks or also simulated storm tracks. And the combination of those things are coming or are resulting then into this PMO curve. So you see here, these are thousands and thousands of storm tracks, a quite impressive picture, I find. So just to summarize the setup of a PMO curve, which information is required? So first of all, we need the input of the geographical information on the liabilities of risks. Then it is important to know which occupancy type is covered. On the rough level, we talk about residential, commercial, or industrial risks. And then detailed information, of course, could also help about buildings contents and business interruptions, which reflect the damage ratio may be more appropriate. Furthermore, I think this is then the more scientific section, the intensity field of the scenarios and the vulnerability of your risks is. And finally, this is again the financial aspects, the values of the risks, and also the insurance features which are impacting the risk itself, like deductibles or limits. Good. This was on a rough basis, NatCat modeling. I hope at least you have some insights how to come up with some premium here. I will take now the rest 30 minutes or 20 to 30 minutes to focus on NatCat pricing in reinsurance. So as I mentioned before at the beginning of this presentation, I think we will not go into the general pricing in reinsurance, but would like to focus more on the NatCat pricing section. There are some differences, but I think I assume that most people had already some sessions about reinsurance pricing, but I would like to start maybe from the beginning, and I would like to talk about the typical reinsurance program. In general, I think here on the left-hand side, we have the proportional with the typical types of as a quota share and a surplus, and we have non-proportional reinsurance. I think non-proportional can also split into the excess of loss part And there is also one product which is called stop loss or aggregate, but we would like to focus on the excess of loss part. And here we will not focus on the risk excess of loss part, which is covering single risks. We would like to consider or focus on the CAT-XL peer event part here. And just to give you some classification and just to recap the non-proportionate section here, non-proportionate treaties are usually classified by the type of loss to which the priority and limit are applied. For example, Risk XL is the typical reinsurance structure to cover single risk losses. For example, you have one house you would like to cover or one shop. And on the other side, you have the peer event excess of loss. The peer event excess of loss covers the accumulation of many single losses arising out of one event. And this will be our focus in the next section. And finally, we have here the stop loss, and the stop loss accumulates all losses occurring during one period. So we have a typical notation for excess of loss treaties, which is limit, excess, priority. And put here again some numbers. For example, if we are talking about a layer with 2 million excess 1 million, and we have one loss occurring with 1.8 million, then only the excess part of the priority, which is here 1 million, is covered by the reinsurer, which is 800,000 here. I think this principle, I have here again a slide. We have here agreed on a priority. We have here the limit. The blue and the green bar is more or less the loss. And what is now covered by the reinsurer is only the excess part of the priority here. And if, for example, the loss is going or exceeds the ceiling here, or the limit, then the reinsurer will pay only the full limit, and the excess part is going back into the retention of the insurance company. So what does this mean now for CAT-XL programs? So we have here a program with 10 million excess 10 million. So I put the numbers here in 1000 just to have better transparency here. We have here 10 risks of an insurance company. And we will now observe 6 individual losses in the portfolio. So we have in the first loss is 2 million, second loss is 8 million, third loss is maybe 1.5 million, or it should be maybe 2 million. So 6 losses were caused by the same event, for example, an earthquake. And the CAT-XL works now like that all losses are summed up here together. Then the accumulated loss in this situation is 19 million. And then the event structure is applied, which means finally, after the application of the event structure, 9 million is covered by the reinsurer, and 10 million, which means the loss up to the priority, is covered by the insurance company. This is just in a nutshell the operation or the principle of the CAT-XL treaty in reinsurance. So in general, CAT events for reinsurers, they are covered in general via proportional contracts and also non-proportional contracts. And for non-proportional contracts, we saw this in this example before. We have this typical CAT-XL contract, but if we come now to the pricing methods, I think in both contract types, if we talk about proportional or non-proportional treaties, the types of the price or the pricing methods and approaches are similar and can be applied on both contract types. And I think I would like to focus now on the two typical pricing methods. One is the loss experience pricing and the other is the exposure pricing. So in general, we separate between loss experience and exposure pricing. And as the name says, here for the loss experience, I think the loss experience is based in most cases, or is based on historical loss information. And here the most typical pricing methods in loss experience is the so-called burning cost and the collective model, which is based on mathematical distributions. It's not the easiest part, the collective model, but I would like to give you at least some slides about the collective model to see how this works. But I would like to start now with the loss experience, with the burning cost. And yeah, I prepared here, first of all, the definition of burning cost. So the burning cost, or we can also say the expected loss, is the sum of all excess of loss claims, what you can see here. And if you would like to earn this back after a certain period, or if you get the premium year by year, the formula is that you just calculate the excess of loss claims, which is the part which exceeds the priority, what I showed before. And you can divide this by number of years, and then you have the net premium, which you have to charge to pay back those losses, more or less. So this is, I think, a quite important formula here. Total excess of loss claims divided the number of years. So I think if you had some webinars already with the burning cost, with the standard burning cost, I think you will see here some differences between burning costs in NatCat and burning cost, what is used in general for single risks, for example. And this is the number of years. But I think this is quite detailed information, but I think you should just take up this formula that over the years you have to earn back the excess of loss claim. So I just rewrite this on the top. The total of excess claim could be written down as number of claims times the average claim. So if you multiply the number of claims, what you see in your portfolio, and multiply this with the average excess of loss claim, then you get, of course, the total excess of excess of loss claims. And if you're at this stage, then you can just take those two components, number of claims divided by number of years, and this directly determines your loss frequency here. And the other part is the loss severity. And then you are again back to the general formula. Your expected loss is the loss frequency times the loss severity. And we will discuss then later on also the mathematical functionality, the collective model. And I think this is exactly then the mathematical distribution you will apply, one for the loss frequency and the other for the loss severity. So I put here now an example just to show you the basic approach and method of the burning cost calculation. So we have a layer 4 million excess 1 million. We observed 2 unindexed claims. I think I will come back then in the next slide about indexation. but we have, in the first example, we have unindexed claims. In 2017, we have 1.25 million unindexed claim. This should be an event here. And in 2018, we have observed also an unindexed claim of 1.9 million. So if you apply now the layer structure, then the reinsurer will pay 250 for the first claim. So you will deduct the 1,000 here and the 900. So you see the calculation here on this comment field as well. So if you now apply the burning cost, then you will sum up the two claims, which is 1,000,000.15, and you divide this by the observation period, which is 6 years, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then you have the burning cost amount you would charge. And of course, this is only the net premium. If you talk about then the real premium, which has to be charged, you have to put in loadings like the internal costs and the capital costs and so on. But this is now a pure net loss view, more or less. So the next step is the indexation process for the historical losses. And I think indexation is one of the core parts in loss experience pricing. And the basic idea is here to estimate the loss cost for the treaty period based on historical losses. I think the issue is when you have losses which occurred 10 years ago, then you would expect that the same loss will cost much more due to the experience inflation per year. This process to bring the values of the losses in the past to the values now of present is called indexation. And indexing historical losses for cat business is based on the portfolio size, which means if you see a double size of the portfolio, then you will expect a double event loss of the covered portfolio. So give you here an example. Let us assume you have a portfolio with the size of 100 billion. Sorry, with 100 billion, and you have a loss event in this year with 200 million. Then after 2 years, you expect or you have a portfolio size with 400 billion now, which is based on the sums insured. And the question would be then, what is the expected loss event in the year 2022, where I have the portfolio size of 400 billion instead of the 100 billion where I observed the loss. And the calculation is quite simple. So you just take the development or the growth of your portfolio, which is 400 divided by 100, and multiply this by the observed loss in 2020, which is 200. And finally, you come up then with the indexed loss of 800. This is in a simple nutshell, more or less, the indexation process. And I put here again an example. We have again this layer structure, 4 million excess 1 million. We have here the cross loss is unindexed, what we saw before. This is 1.25 million and here 1.9 million. And we have here already calculated the cross losses indexed. And how did we come up with this cross loss index? So we look to the development of your portfolio. And I think in the past, in the previous slide, we took here the sums insured. But in many cases, because we don't have always the information as a reinsurer about the historical development of the sums insured, we can also take the GMPI, which is the premium income of this contract. We can also use as a synonym for the portfolio growth, and which means, for example, if we would like to index this loss to the value of 2023. We take the growth, which is 18 million divided by 10 million, multiplied by this unindexed loss, and then you come up with the 2.25 million. And the same is done then with the loss in 2018, but instead, of course, the portfolio size in 2017, you consider here the portfolio size of 2018. And then again, you apply the final burning cost formula, which is summing up the excess loss part is here 3.1 million. So you have first deduct here 1 million because of your layer structure here. And then you come up with 3.1 million divided your observation period, and this is then 417. And just to give you again a comparison, what we calculate at the beginning, this was the unindexed version, it was 192. And now if we consider the indexation, the inflation in the portfolio and in the calculation, you come up with 517, and it's always almost double. And I think this makes a little bit difficult also discuss with the clients then the effect of indexation here. Okay. If you now look to the examples we gave in previous slides, you will see directly the data requirements for doing a burning cost calculation. And first of all, a complete list of historical losses should be provided. And if possible, the loss information should be split more granular. For example, if you could get different occupancy types or the location, region or area, or also the occupancy subtypes like building contents and business interruption. This could help at the end to reflect your portfolio composition in a better way. So this is just a list of some losses which occurred in South Africa with hailstorm and mainly hail and storm, and we had, of course, this bushfire in 2017. But also the recent flood event, of course. I think it's, again, a quite challenging component how to assess this natural peril. So furthermore, we have, we come to the exposure information, which is required for exposure and for loss experience pricing as well. So basically the information is provided on cluster zone in the most markets here in Africa. And I think cluster zone is more or less the standard format for cat exposure. And for example, in South Africa, we have 16 zones. And for the indexation process, I mentioned this shortly before. I think we, in general, look for the historical development of the client, of the exposure, and of the client, of course. And I think if you don't get this information, then you have to use the premium income, what I mentioned before. So I think I just would like to motivate now the next topic, which is the collective model. So we have in this situation, we have two gross losses on an index basis, which is 2.25 million and 2.85 million. And if we change now the structure to 2 million excess 3 million, and you would like to apply the burning cost, you see this here on the bottom, you have 0. But of course, there is a probability that you will see also some losses in excess of 3 million, for example. And I think this is the motivation to jump over to the collective model, where you use then mathematical distribution, and you will try, based on your experience losses to extrapolate your losses. And with this extrapolation, you can finally then calculate also a layer with 2 million excess 3 million. I will not go too much into detail, but I will give you at least some insights. So the collective model consists of a loss severity here, which can be derived from the historical loss information. And the loss severity can in general be derived from fitting a mathematical distribution to the indexed losses. And examples, the typical examples are Pareto distribution, but you can also use exponential distributions or gamma distributions. This is just to give you some mathematical background here. For the loss frequency, the fit is done to the number of losses. And the typical examples are here Poisson distribution or negative binomial distribution. And if you came up with a fit for the loss severity here, and if you came up with the loss frequency, then you can apply, for example, a so-called pension method to combine those two distributions, and then you have one total loss distribution. And I think we come back here again to the formula I explained on the top, or I motivated on the top, that you have then the expected number of the losses, which is the loss frequency. Then you multiply this with the expected loss amount, which is the loss severity, and finally you come up here with the total premium. So this is just a graphical overview how you could come up with a Pareto fit, for example, with the loss severity. So let us assume you have several historical losses like here, which we already, or we assume that they are already indexed. You can then sort the losses in order and rotate then the losses here. You can see this is just the ordering, and then it's rotated. And you can already see here that you get a kind of distribution shape. And I think this is exactly then used for the Pareto fit. As you can see here, you will try to fit a distribution here along those individual dots here, or points. And then you get, if you get then here your final distribution fit. This is more or less the basic principle of fitting a distribution to loss experience losses. And for example, you can, maybe it's not, it's hardly to see, but I think in general you could get then also a price or premium for the upper part, where you have not experienced any losses, for example, which would be here in this part. Here, I think you will get some results because you have experienced some losses, but you can use the distribution then for the upper part to come up with some premium calculation. So I would like to give you a short summary of the characteristics of Pareto pricing. So in general, the Pareto pricing should be comparable to the burning cost loss, at least in the loss affected area. I think one big advantage of the collective model is that even in loss-free layer segments, you can get some premium results. And for especially for cut programs, it's important because I think in many cases you have high layers where the priority is on a quite high level, and I think you will not have so much experience there, and then the Pareto model or Pareto Poisson model can be quite well used here for calculating the cut exposure here. I think this is now the last slide. This is related to the exposure models. So the typical NatCat models for exposure which are used in reinsurance pricing is RMS. But we have also, of course, the Munich Re hazard model or EQE-CAT. As you learned in our first section, the models needs here granular input data to come up with an appropriate model. I think the most typical information which is used are sums insured, limits, deductibles for the individual required locations. So quite detailed information you need to feed into those tools. But I think there are also in some companies and also in markets some rough models in place where you only use the Cresta information, for example. And I think the Cresta information has those, well, it's a rough model, of course, but at least you could come up with a market model to calculate your exposure here. So that's it. I hope you get at least some insights for NatCat modeling in the first part and its application in reinsurance pricing. But I think you see that I think this is just a simplified approach, what I presented here. And I think if you go into detail and do one example, you will see that it's a whole process is much more complicated as I gave you here. So thank you very much. And I think I'm open for some questions. I think we have still some time until next presentation from SIPO in respect of political violence exposure is done.
Okay, Klaus, there's a question about clarity on return periods and how we can know the same for certain countries.
Well, I think the return period, as I mentioned, it's more done from the scientists, and I think they use also different soft factors, of course, like the soil conditions and so on, to have this comparison in respect of return periods. And I have to admit that, of course, I think this is the key challenge, more or less, to come up with a certain return period. And I think together with the scientists, I think you have to discuss this and to come up with certain return period. Yeah. But of course, okay, the key element for assessing the risk at the end. So the Mercalli intensity gives you some, at least, direction in the return period. And what is the most common pricing method on the African continent, where there are issues of lag too? Oh, I have to check, sorry.
Okay, thanks, Klaus. I hope that answers your question, Mohammed. The second question is from Tionge. It says, is it usual to amend the number of hours to qualify a single event, or should it be a standard, usually 72 hours, but others request for 168 or 336
I think
days?
the hours clause, I think, of course, is a typically reinsurance feature in the contract between insurance companies and reinsurance companies. And I think there are some differences from market to market. I think we saw in the past, in some markets, we have this 72 hours clause. This is right, which is 3 days in a row, which are covered via events. So if you talk about earthquake, you have, of course, these aftershocks, which should be considered. But we see also for some perils, we see, for example, the 168 hours clause. And I think if you talk about floods, for example, it could take quite a long until the flood disappeared again, and then all losses are covered within this period. Yeah. But there is you're right, there is a standard format where we are using as an hours clause in the reinsurance contract. Mm-hmm.
All right, thank you, Klaus. The following question says, when it says X amount or higher in Y number of years, please explain why it should not be X amount or lower in Y number of years. Maybe.
Well, I think the term or higher refers to number of years. So you expect, for example, a 10 million loss either every 10 years or 10 years or higher. So which means you have to earn back this 10 million loss in 10 years. I'm not sure if this answers the question already.
Hopefully it does. But please let us know if your answer your question is answered. I'll move on to the next question. What is the most common pricing method on the African continent where there are issues of lack of location data being captured for risks?
So in respect of NatCat pricing, this is a very good question, because for NatCat pricing, we don't have detailed information, and we are not having a detailed RMS model, for example. In most situations, the model is based on Cresta information. And I think here, if you talk about hail, for example, then you can use statistical information here as well. And based on this, based on the Cresta, you are applying a more or less a market curve, considering the loss statistics. For earthquake, it's sometimes a little bit tricky because you don't have this kind of loss history. Here, I think you have to discuss this with the geo experts and come up with certain market models here. But I think in general, it's what we are using is a kind of also collective model, which is a kind of either a Poisson, a Pareto model, or you can use Bohr distributions. And you simulate also kind of market scenarios what could occur in your country. And based on that, you create your distribution. Yeah.
All right, thank you. Moving on to the next question from Lawrence. Is it possible to provide a confidence level when using a CAT model?
Yeah, well, I think if you have a kind of distribution, you can provide this confidence level, but there is no standard confidence level, but you can provide that. Sure.
All right. This is a long one from Sonia. I think she starts with a, I'm assuming it's she. It starts with a comment. I talk about hazard, which is one element of the risk function. We are all aware of that climate change is affecting all of us around the world. In Mauritius, we are cyclone prone country, and the pattern in the past is that we used to have a strong cyclone every 15 years. But since February 1994, following Hollanda, we did not really face any huge cyclone or MTS. Was lucky that some of them did not hit the land. But this pattern of 15 years is no longer valid. Since 2013, we faced our first flash floods, and this is a new event which Mauritius never experienced before, and now it is becoming more and more recurring. How does Munich Re tackle all of this? Is this is the risk modeling being reviewed regularly to take all those new hazards? We have seen also hail, which was never the case in Mauritius, but it was mild. How would you tackle Mauritius in your risk modeling and the return period with all those new events and changes in climate change?
Okay, thanks. Very good question. And I think climate change is, of course, really a topic, because we are, well, how should I put it? Are we surprised or sometimes surprised about the intensity of the event? But of course, we should not. And I think this factor, it's maybe not a soft factor, the climate change factor. I think this is a quite challenging part which has to be considered in the risk model, and especially, for example, in Mauritius, or I think also in Mozambique, we saw quite intense events, but also a high loss frequency here. And of course, we consider that in our model, and we research not every year, but in a certain time, we always research the vulnerability and the hazard in those countries, and also in Mauritius. And I think one, of course, statistical methods, but you know, the climate change cannot be reflected in historical information, and therefore you have to rely on the scientific research of your experts here. Yeah. But of course, we are quite aware, and I think also the recent floods in South Africa, I think there are always trends, but also in Europe, we have some severe floods last year in Germany, what we have never seen so far. And I think these are all signals and the indication for the climate change, and has to be considered, of course, prospectively in the reinsurance pricing. Okay.
All right. Thanks, Klaus. And then we have two last questions from Calvin. The first one, are we to use only gross indexed losses in the model?
Yep.
And maybe you can answer that one, and I'll read the
Yeah, I
following
can
one.
already answer this question. We always focus on indexed losses, I think. And you saw the difference between unindexed and indexed loss, but we have to consider the inflation. And I think there are some assumptions, and I think there are already a lot of discussions now, because we see some trends in Europe. It's already here. The hyperinflation we see, or we observe, I think in the past we had inflation of 2 or 3%. Nowadays we see inflation of 7, 8, or up to 10%. And I think also for the countries here in Africa, I think we will expect some increase in inflation, and this has to be considered, of course, in the models.
The second question, if we are to extrapolate losses, the assumption is that the losses shall rise year to year, which might not be the case. Kindly advise on how to accurately focus losses besides the extrapolation method.
Yeah, well, I think the extrapolation is not that we see a rise or increase in the losses, but to consider losses which could occur in future. So if you have, for example, a 5 years observation period where you only had observed losses up to 1 million, then it might be the case that in 10 years you will see one loss with 2 million. And this is done with the extrapolation that your focus is not only 5 years, but then 10 years to consider also these higher losses. I think this extrapolation does not mean that the losses will get higher, but it reflects just that we will see some losses, some higher losses, what we have not seen in the statistics. Yeah.
Thank you, Klaus. I think that is all the questions that we have.
Okay, thank you very much. And then I will hand over either directly to Sippo or Rose. I have to check. Thank you very much. And yeah, looking forward for some further discussions here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to ask Maureen to take up the session. Maureen, guide us through.
Yes, please. Thank you. Thank you, Klaus. Thank you for the participation so far. And thank you to you, Klaus, for the presentation. It is well received. We want to take some few photos as we breathe in and out. So I want to request the class at least to put on your videos, if you don't kindly mind. Then we can take a photo, a screenshot of 1 or 2 photos. Then we can move on to the next presentation. Keep your microphones muted still. Chipper, can help me in taking some screenshots.
Are we supposed to smile?
Yes, please. Keep smiling. It's a number of us. So as you breathe in, breathe out, allow me to continue taking some screenshots.
Yeah, Maureen, but we can only see your face.
Where? No, just change your viewing to the whole gallery. Then you'll be able to see everyone else.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you.
All right. Oh yeah.
Good. Okay. So, Chipo, a few more seconds on your side.
Yeah. Yes, thank you.
You're done?
Yes.
Good class. So thank you for that. We hope that you've refilled your glasses as you get to the next session. So I'll call upon Rose to introduce the next speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Claus, for that session. I'm not a reinsurance person, so I've really benefited from that session. So we are going on to the next session where we are going to have a look at riot and political risk exposure. And at this point, we are going to have Mr. Sifo. Wow, I think you will also pronounce his second name, property underwriter at Munich Re. He started his career in the year 2008, and he has a wide range of experience from being a direct insurer to terrorism underwriting and even natural catastrophe modeling. He is now specializing in property treaty, and he looks at the West African portfolio. He's currently studying to qualify as an actuary through the Casualty Actuarial Society in the United States of America. Mr. Simfo, we are glad and honored to have you on board. Please confirm, please put on your video. The session is basically yours. I'd like to welcome you.
Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Sipho. Can everyone hear me? Please confirm.
No, we can't hear you. The voice is a little bit low.
Is it? Let me try and just speak a little bit louder. Is it better? Is that better?
It's better, but a little bit faint. Maybe members, you can just type on the chat if it's clear on your end. It might be my machine. It's okay. Clear.
Okay. So
welcome.
Thank you. And thank you, Klaus, for the wonderful presentation. Before I even start, let me first start with sharing my screen. Okay, there you go. Please confirm if you can see the screen. Can you see it, Rose? Thank you. So my topic is riot and political risk reinsurance. I will try and keep it as general as possible because I don't think everyone on the platform is a reinsurer. And so I'll just speak about the riot and political risk in general, also known as PVT, political violence and terrorism. So PVT is generally broken down into 5 categories. And the contents of my presentation will be that I'll start by explaining the various categories and talk about its insurability. And by that, I'm talking about us as an industry in general, how we view this from an insurance perspective, and then talk about some concerns, things that we may need to think about when we underwrite these risks. And then towards the end, what I will do is then I'll break it up in the presentation into 2. I'll first talk about terrorism on its own, and then talk about SRCC on its own. SRCC, the riots, strikes, and civil commotion. And then I'll just round it up at the end with the conclusion. So before I even get into it, just like natural catastrophes, we understand PVT generally as high severity, or rather it's in the high severity, low frequency space. And the biggest problem is that we're seeing the frequency in this exposure also increasing, which is something unbeknown to us. So I just want to just state that as a preamble, that the thinking around this is actually very similar to natural catastrophes, and in fact, a lot of the points that Klaus mentioned in his presentations apply here also. However, here then we're seeing just a slight increase in frequencies, which has historically not been the case. So PVT is broken down into, we break it down into 5 categories. So you get war and warlike operations, and then you get overthrowing of the government, you get orders by an authority or a military, and or government authority or a military, and you get the last two that I want to ask to focus on particularly, which is SICC and terrorism. And the reason why we break them up into those five is because there is no common definition as such for PVT. So, and this is one of the difficulties we encounter. I'm quite sure that you also encounter this with clients. Sometimes they don't specify which PVT perils or PVT exposures they would like us to cover, and that's a very important start to that conversation. And from an insurance perspective, then I want to drill down to focusing on three elements of this PVT. So the three elements being the SICC and terror that I said will particularly focus on here, and then the others such as the warlike operation and the overthrowing of the government. They're very close to, or they're closest to war, and we generally deem them as uninsurable, as in that in most treaties and underlying policies, there would be an outright exclusion for those. And for that reason, we will not focus on it during this presentation. We'll just focus on SICC and terror, because I think that's the biggest exposure that we encounter. We see that from a reinsurance perspective, and I'm quite sure on the underlying side also. The next is the insurability. As I said, we will not focus, or in fact, we will not touch on war because we generally deem it as uninsurable. Or in almost all policies and treaties would simply have an outright explicit exclusion for warlike operations, overthrowing of the government, anything related to that. Although I might say that in some territories, they do cover war, but then there are specialist underwriters that underwrite that. Usually, you'll get that cover from the Lloyd's of London. Some of the syndicates would cover it. But in general, in almost all policies and almost all treaties, war and warlike operations, overthrowing of governments, those are general standard exclusions. SICC, on the other hand, is insurable indeed. However, as an industry, we generally have a low appetite for it. Similarly, with terrorism, these two are actually, we've seen that in recent times, there have been a lot of requests for this cover because of the activity that we're seeing around the world, around the continent. A lot of clients feel that at this stage, they would like to have this cover more than they did before, understandably so. It's still insurable. However, as I said, we have a limited or little appetite as an industry for it, for reasons I will explain actually. And in fact, I want to start with some key concerns we have around this, both SICC and terrorism. So some key concerns we have from an underwriting perspective, and these apply both to terrorism and to SICC. One is a high risk of change. So from both, in fact, well, from a terrorism perspective, due to the unpredictable human behavior, terrorism is just prone to a lot of risk of change. And as SICC also, the events we saw perhaps 15, 20 years ago are not the same as events we see today, especially in size and magnitude. And that's exactly the risk of change I'm talking about. This risk is changing to a point where the outlook we had on it previously is different from the outlook we have on it today. And the other is the risk of error. And this applies again to both SICC and terrorism, in that we usually don't have access to credible and vast data, both from an exposure and from a loss perspective. So yes, we've seen certain events historically, But then a lot of those events we don't think that they accurately depict what we actually, the exposure we're in for going forward. And due to this, then there's usually an innate risk of error when we price this, because the data we have is not as, let me put it this way. When we price a standard fire portfolio, we generally have a lot of granular data, a lot of data that we can apply, or rather a lot of data we can use to fit our models, loss models, exposure models, and it's usually very granular, very clear. But unfortunately, we don't have the same luxury when it comes to Terra and SICC. And due to that, then there's always that our margin of error here is, well, not margin of error, but our pricing is prone to error in general. And that's a big concern. It's for a large part, it's usually a step in the dark, and I don't think we want to do that with the insurance business. The last key concern, out of many, I've just given just a few of them, of the key ones. The last one on my list here is the interconnected world we now live in. So for example, from an SICC perspective, a strike that we may have had, a riot we may have had in the United States in 30 years ago could have just started in the United States and ended in the United States. But now, because of the internet and social media, we are now so connected as the world. We don't only see news in the newspapers and news on TV. We see news as it happens on our phones. We walk around with news. And that then has caused, again, it speaks to the real risk of change that we're seeing in this this exposure, that like an event such as the BLM, Black Lives Matter, historically such events may have just started and ended in the United States, but now it took over the entire world. Same in South Africa. So the losses we are seeing now are very different from losses we saw historically because of this. We had one of our big losses I think about 6 years ago. It was from fees must fall. The universities were striking against high university fees. And that strike started from one university, the University of Cape Town, and it became a national riot and a huge riot, again, because of the interconnected world that we live in. And that is a big concern. So in general, those are, again, the issues we see with both Terra and SICC. In fact, the interconnected world also applies to Terra, because now in this day and age, terrorists around the world also use social media to recruit, so which was not the case before. So historically, to be part of a certain terrorist group, you had to be in the region, you had to know people who are part of the group. But now, even I would not be a terrorist, but even someone like me could easily be poached or recruited through social media. And that's the interconnected world that has changed this risk so greatly. Now, as I said, I will now focus on the two areas separately. One part of this presentation, or one half of this presentation, will be on terrorism, and then the other will be on SICC. Starting with terrorism. So the definition of terrorism is the use of violence to cause intimidation to achieve a certain political aim. And I'll say a political, I'll put that in inverted commas, because it does not necessarily have to be political, but we'll use that term loosely. And now the issue with this word is that it is also used generally quite loosely, because there is no easy, especially from an insurance perspective, there is no easy and generally accepted definition, especially in terms of what particular sub-perils are in this. So what we usually see with terrorism is that all these terms that we usually see being thrown around, such as sabotage, insurrection, and other isolated events, such isolated attacks, such as 9/11. 9/11 was an isolated attack on that on the World Trade Center, right? And so all of these things then are usually form part of what we call terrorism. And the difficulty we encounter with a lot of clients is that when they ask us for TPVT or terrorism cover, we usually don't get granular definition of what exposure they would like to cover themselves against. And this is very, very important, because we don't want to just say that we are covering terrorism. We want to, I want to know exactly what terrorism, what aspect of terrorism would you like cover against? And I just wanted to talk about also some challenges about this risk terrorism or this exposure terrorism. So the first is that this is extremely unpredictable. And so if you may remember from Klaus's presentation, a lot of it was, so he has a very solid understanding, or we have a very solid understanding of the various perils within natural catastrophe, in the natural catastrophe space at least. We understand hail, we understand earthquakes, we understand cyclones, to the point where we can even predict when a cyclone is coming. We can say that, in fact, in South Africa, perils like hail, the insurance companies would actually send clients SMSs saying that please expect a hail at 5 o'clock today or around 5 o'clock today. So it is, we have understood those perils to the extent where we can predict them. Terrorism, and as I said, well, terrorism in this instance is almost completely unpredictable. These attacks happen with no expectation from anyone, they just happen. And that is a big problem. And in the sense that it makes them very, very different from the other types of risks that we insure in the fire space. So in the fire space, if we're talking about Flexa, if we're talking about natural catastrophes, those we have a good grasp on those exposures, we understand them and we can predict them. And the really key reason for us having a limited appetite for terrorism is that it is extremely unpredictable, unlike the other exposures that we cover in fire. And this is because, again, of these three points that I've then marked as point 2, 3, and 4, which is why, well, number 2, we actually discovered that there is no common profile to terrorism or to terrorists. So when studies were made, they cannot say that terrorists are usually Arabic, terrorists are usually of this religion, terrorists are usually of, so all of those are misconceptions. So the United States, for example, may think that Arabic people are general, well, they may think that a lot of them are terrorists. No, that is a complete misconception. People, they can look like me, they can look like anyone. They can be from any country, they can be from any religion. And point 3, they can be, there's no common cause either. So there are many reasons why people may partake in terrorism acts, and it's not the same cause. It's not, they're not common. I could have my own reasons. I could form my own group today, which I will not, as I said, I'm not a terrorist. I could form my own group today with our own reason, and we go and attack a building or go and attack a government institution. And that's a problem. No common causes, no profile. That's unpredictable. And again, no common methods. We've seen this from people, suicide bombings to different types of attacks. So absolutely no profile, no common profile, no common cause, and no common methods. And for that, it's extremely unpredictable. But what I can do is perhaps maybe just talk about some examples of causes. And again, I'm wary of even mentioning these as these examples, because people may think that this is, for the most part, people commit terrorism acts because of this. No, again, it can be, I could be disgruntled by something completely different from any attack we've seen before. That's the big problem with terrorism. It is that unpredictable. So sometimes we've seen these for economic reasons. And again, so it could be that, well, I could be performing an act for economic reasons. We've seen these for political intentions. You've seen religious extremism all around the world, and mighty terrorism. Those are the people that go on suicide bombs. And again, different causes from different groups all around the world. They have their own different causes. And again, the issue that this does not have to be performed by groups. It could be individuals, and each individual has their own cause. That's the difficulty we find that. Want to talk briefly though about terrorism within the African space, within the continent. Generally, when we think of terrorism, we think of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and other groups outside the continent. However, we have a couple of groups even within the continent. Yes, we've seen some attacks, and because of that, we know that they must come from some group, right? And they do. We've seen attacks from Codeco in the DRC. We've seen the Al-Shabaab in Al-Shabaab is in the Horn of Africa. Actually, they are in Somalia. Yes, they're in the Horn of Africa, and a few. These have resulted in a number of attacks over the years. From all the way from Bring Back Our Girls by Boko Haram. In fact, in 2020 alone, we've seen about 4 such attacks. One was in Nigeria, in Zamfara, by this was by a group named what is the name of the group? I just forgot the name of the group, but these guys, they usually do farming incidents. So in particular incident, for example, that this was a mass shooting where more than 200 people died. This happened in January this year. That was a cattle battle in Nigeria. And yes, so, and they've been doing this act since 2011, actually. Another one we saw was another mass shooting again in the DRC, and that was by a group called Codeco, the one I mentioned in the other slide. And the interesting thing about this group is that they actually started off as just a corporation, a farming corporation. They started off as a farming corporation with no terrorist intentions, and over the years they changed. And we've seen this again, how unpredictable this exposure is. Even in South Africa, for example, we had one called PAGAT, People Against Drugs and People Against Drugs and Gangsterism, which is a noble cause, right? And later they've had their own attacks within South Africa. So even within Southern Africa, we have smaller groups that may initiate smaller attacks, but you can never know what that can progress to in the future. We saw a bombing in Somalia also in February. And so these two, the one in February and then March, were actually interlinked in that they were politically motivated. I think there was a politician that they killed from the one on the 19th of February, and that killed 14 people. And one gentleman, this was a suicide bombing. One gentleman walked into a restaurant, and his bomb just went off, and 14 people died. They did it again in March, and 48 people died. So we've seen a couple of these internationally over the years, and I find it quite astonishing that only in 2022, we have seen 4 already. And we can expect that there will probably be a few more that will happen in the air and just in the continent. And again, speaking to unpredictable, this risk is we can expect, but we can never know when and how big the event might be. That is the terrorism exposure in a nutshell. And I now want to touch on the SICC exposure. So as I said, SICC, the word SICC stands for strikes, riots, and civil commotion. And the interesting thing about SICC is that in the terrorism space, historically, we've always thought that, but not in the terrorism space, in the PVT, political violence and terrorism space. Okay. In the PVT space, we've always thought that our largest exposure arises from terrorism. And this is following events such as the 9/11 and other strikes we've seen around the world. We've always thought that when we see the big losses that we can incur from PVT will come from one government institution being attacked, or one of those big airports being attacked and at once. But what we're seeing, however, is that those in recent times are resulting in more deaths than property damage. However, SICC is resulting in a lot of property damage. We've seen this all around the world. We had one in South Africa. I'm quite sure you'd be aware of the riots we had in 2021. And that loss was a 36 billion loss, insured loss, and 50 billion loss to the economy. And so this is now becoming an area of focus and an area of concern, because we think that a lot of our losses in the PVT space will be coming from this more than the terrorism itself. And when we looked at, we looked at events, SICC events around the world, from the Chile lanes to the Arab Spring to the losses that I just talked about now that happened in South Africa in 2021. And what we found is, unlike terrorism, SICC, on the other hand, in fact, does have common contributing factors or common causes or motivation for the acts. And the most that we've seen, economic inequality. If you look at Chile, Arab Spring, a lot of the countries that were involved in those events or in those SICC events were economically unequal. Those communities and had been crying and had been complaining about economic inequality for a very long time. In fact, some of the intel we have on SICC is that a lot of communities that have had these events, they had been going through these points that I've pointed here, which is the corruption, dictatorship, economic inequality, corruption, dictatorship, economic distress. I'll talk about COVID just now. They've been going through those for a very, very, very long time. They've been, even before the big Chile lane that we saw, even before the Black Lives Matter that we saw in the United States, the community in the United States had been complaining about the citizens that were being killed by the police. And so these had been brewing for a very, very, very long time. And then what then usually happens is one event happens, and then when that happens, so one event happens, for example, the boy who drew the graffiti in Syria, that's the one that pricked the event in Syria during the Arab Spring. The gentleman who set himself alight in Egypt, that's the one event that pricked the frustration. And yes, so and in South Africa, the number 5 was what then happened to us. We were in COVID, in the middle of the COVID, in the middle of the pandemic, and people are passing away. We have lockdowns. There's been a big distress in the economy because of the COVID. People have lost their jobs, companies have closed down. So we were a very, very, very frustrated society. And then what happened was our then ex-president, Zuma, gets arrested, and that was a quit. So what we've seen at SRCC is that at least there is some level of predictability, if you like, although it's also not as predictable as traditional fire business, which is our main business, right? It's not as predictable, but at least with SICC, these common factors are usually the drivers. They're usually what has been going in the society before the large event happens. The only problem is that you also can never know when it will happen. In fact, one, you can never know when it will happen, and two, there are many societies with these factors already. In fact, there are very few societies that are not complaining at all about the economy, their leadership. So these are to some extent are there, but then when they grew to a point where people can just get extremely frustrated, and then it just takes one event, such as the incarceration of our ex-president Zuma in South Africa, and then there will be an event like ours. And I also want to share a few events that we've seen around the world. Again, speaking to just, and the point of my next slide is just explaining, like illustrating just one, how much this exposure has changed over the years. And the point that I made earlier on, which is that now, because of the interconnected world, what historically may have been a small event, now they become very, 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 very large events. A simple one, one is the one that we had in 2021, in July 2021 in South Africa, the riots in South Africa. Those historically we've had a lot of such politically motivated strikes and riots, but they remain small. So historically, what would happen is that there would be one politician, and the politician is in court, or the politician gets incarcerated, and we'll see it in the news, and there will be strikes maybe in that city where they are, but it just does not get as big as it is because we are that connected. And then you can also throw in the other vectors that I spoke about, which is the economic distress and what are called the side effects of COVID, and there you have it. And we have a loss as big as, in rent terms at least, that was 36 billion. And we had the Black Lives Matter. So I will not go through all of them one by one, but the main point I'm trying to highlight with this slide is that recent losses that we have seen from SICC are now a lot bigger than what we saw historically. And again, it's so important what I said about the interconnected world, which is that historically, an event such as Black Lives Matter would have been small. In fact, the United States did see, this is not the first big movement that the United States has seen. There was one, I think this was in the 60s or 70s, Emmett Till. When Emmett Till was killed, that was a big movement, huge riot in the United States, and that caused a big change in the society as a whole. And however, the death of Emmett Till, which was as big an event, or not from a riot and strike perspective, but from a social perspective, it was as big an event in the United States as this one. That did not take over the world. And again, showing just how much the world has changed from those times to these times. We're in that connected world now, where one cause, one strike can just spread. It can spread across the continent. It can spread across the world. And for that reason, we need to just be really, really cautious of this exposure, because it has changed immensely from what we traditionally know it as. So yeah, it was a few of them, the one in Hong Kong, the one in Chile, the famous one in Arab Spring. The Arab Spring, interestingly, so one of the, so I mean, it started in Tunisia, right, and found its way, again, we're an interconnected world, found its way all the way to Egypt, all the way to Syria, just like that. Now, the interesting thing about this is, for example, the one or the leg of this protest that got to Egypt, the one that was the one that there was a famous picture of a gentleman that had set himself alight, and that's what took over the world. And that image is what then caused the big uproar and the big riot in Egypt. And the interesting thing about that is that
no problem.
So could you please mute yourself? Okay, I can continue. So the interesting thing about that leg of the Arab Spring, right, was that was the picture that took over the world, and we thought that was the beginning of the Egypt part, right? However, what we don't know is that for that picture to even make it to mainstream media, to the news, it was actually from the internet. So the gentleman said,
Sifo, you're muted.
Hi, Sifo. Kindly unmute yourself.
sorry, I didn't realize
Good,
I was muted. Sorry, I didn't realize I was muted.
Thank you.
So I mean, in fact, the last point I was making with the slide was just I was talking about the Arab Spring and the fact that so the main point of the slide was, as I said, the main point of the slide was just to show that just like Black Lives Matter, the Emmett Till event did happen in the United States, but it did not take over the world. But now, when George Floyd happened, that took over the world because of the fact that we are an interconnected world. And then I was just saying, even within the Arab Spring, the leg of it that was in Egypt, even though we saw on the news, on all the TVs or on all the news channels, CNN and all of the BBC, and then even though we saw the picture of the gentleman that had set himself alight, but for that picture to even make it to mainstream news, how it made it to mainstream news was bloggers. So the event happened, the gentleman set himself alight, but no one knew about it. It never got to mainstream media. But the minute bloggers took over the internet, sharing that news, and then it woke us up as the world. So that's the danger of the current time that we are in, that because we're so connected in social media and the internet, it's very, very, very easy for what would historically have been a small event, a small riot, for it to just take over the whole country or take over the whole continent or take over the entire world. So that was the main point of the slide, just to show just what world we are in now compared to what we were historically. And just as a last point on that, as on these examples, for example, I just wanted to share what happened in South Africa in the 2021 riot. That riot is the biggest riot we've ever seen as a country, a very, very sad time for us because we lost lives, we lost jobs, we lost livelihoods, our malls were closed because of that looting, and the insurance industry, or at least our rise in strikes and terrorism insurer, Sasria, lost a good 37 billion from that event. And pardon me, that was the insured loss, but then on top of what they lost, or on top of what they paid as Sasria, there was also reinsurance. We as reinsurers lost our own bits, and some of it was actually topped up by the government. So, but yes, a 50 billion loss to the economy. There were 200 malls that were looted. There were 3,000 stores. This was 1,400 ATMs that were damaged. It was, I'm quite sure you saw the visuals on TV. It was a very, very, very dark and ugly time in our country. And this is, it just goes to show how severe this exposure can be, how dark and difficult a time it can put us through as a country and as a country's economy and as an industry, as the insurance industry. In fact, lastly, or not lastly, but just again, in the spirit of how much this exposure is changing, how big the risk of change actually is. Again, from the example I made about Emmett Till and George Floyd events in the United States. So yeah, we do live in a time where, in fact, historically, we have almost always viewed SICC, including terror exposure, as sleep easy cover. It's not anymore, because these events, again, they start like a wildfire. It's like just now you can just literally just drop a matchstick somewhere and it just becomes one big wildfire. It can become one big wildfire. So that's the changing landscape that we're now in. And so some events, just some examples, some other examples of like very, very big events. And a lot of people sometimes did not even know about these events, but they happened. So there was one that started in 2011. It was called the Occupy movement. So this riot went all around the world. It started in 2011, went all around the world, 950 cities, 82 countries. These people were complaining, were protesting against social and economic inequality. And they would have these riots, and a lot of people all around the world got involved again because of how connected we are, and that's how easy it is for these events to take over the world. One, I'm not sure if you are aware of this one. One was called Fridays for Future. Fortunately, again, these ones did not result in losses as such, but if you can get 82 countries to be involved in one movement, that is a lot of people. That is a lot of people. And we can never know how different societies around the world in those 82 countries can react to the same riot. With Fridays for Future, that one started in 2019, and this movement was for or against climate change, just bringing awareness to climate change, protesting against everything we do to not protect our ozone layer, and this it was not one strike. So they would do what they would do, and it was not even one group as such. It started as one group of a small group of people, but then it became an international movement. And these people would do this on Fridays. Every Friday, they would go out and march, and there were 4,500 strikes all around the world. And this spread over 150 countries, and there were 4 million protesters. That's how big these movements can be. And fortunately, again, as I said, in these ones, we did not see any economic losses. But the point I'm trying to make here is that in the time that we now live in, and in the time that we live in, And again, with the other point that I made earlier, which is that we now even see this as even a bigger threat to our industry than terrorism. This is how big these events or these strikes can be, and this is how wide they can go internationally. We saw, I won't even talk about Black Lives Matter that started in Minneapolis. That fact that went over 3 continents. And the interesting thing about Black Lives Matter is that it started off as obviously, it started off because of the attack or the killing of George Floyd. And it started off as that, and can someone please mute themselves? Okay, I'll continue. So it started off as a racial fight in the United States, and even when it went internationally, it went as Black Lives Matter, right? But however, this found itself in sport. There were teams around the world that were complaining about racism within their sporting code. It found itself in the point I'm trying to make here is that it quickly took over the world, even in different forms now. And that's just the extent to which these small events can go. And again, it takes one break. The United States had been a frustrated society for a very, very long time on these issues. And then it took one event to break it, and it just exploded. Exploded went over the world. So that is how much this risk is changing. And I just want to talk briefly about some underwriting considerations, however, some factors that we can, or factors that we consider when we think about when we look at this exposure, and factors that I would like to encourage all of us as underwriters to look into. So one, and this is so critical, historically, it's always been that, for example, it's always been that because we don't get granular data, we don't usually have granular data on where the exposure is. So historically, we were not able to even ascertain what occupancies are more hazardous than others. But with time, we do get some data. We, at least from a loss perspective in South Africa, we had the rise in 2021, and from that we can have a good idea as to what occupancy were mostly hit by such events, and now we need to pay particular attention to this. So we do have some occupancies such as supermarkets, shopping malls. We saw these were looted quite a lot then. And in riots, people tend to, or these occupancies tend to be vulnerable. Electric shops, electronics are people's favorites because, again, it's probably because they're easier to carry during the riots. And bank branches and ATMs, it's money. If they can explode the ATMs and get money out of it, they will. And government businesses, of course, government businesses. In fact, during the riot we had in 2021, there were, just before the military got involved, there were talks that they were moving towards one of our oil suppliers, which is a key institution, and that would have been a disaster for the nation. In fact, they were moving to that would have been a complete disaster to the nation. So when we underwrite these risks, we need to pay particular attention to these critical occupancies, in the sense that they not every occupancy is equally vulnerable. There are others that are more than others, that are more vulnerable than others. And occupancies, the next is locations also. So not all locations are equally vulnerable. And also on certain locations that we know that should there be an SSC event, where it might be the business capital of the country, it might be just an industrial capital. So on those locations, then we also need to ensure that there's we sub-limit the exposure. We price it well and we sub-limit. Again, similarly, actually, with the critical occupancies, we at least need to put on some sub-limit, and and we need to ensure that we price those almost conservatively. And another is that with similarly to natural catastrophes, with a lot of these events, they've been aftershock. So there is usually the one big riot, and then some months later, or with less than a year later, there will be smaller ones. And then they happen frequently. So one of the points could be that you exclude those aftershocks, or at least limitation would not necessarily be effective there because they're usually small, but it would be probably more prudent to exclude the aftershocks. CBI is, in South Africa at least, is generally excluded from SICC, to the point that our one terrorism pool that covers SICC and SICC and terrorism, they explicitly exclude CBI. So for a loss to be covered, it needs to be at the insured premises. Anything that's outside the insured premises will not be insured. So they only cover BI losses and not CBI losses. And we find that to be a prudent practice, because there are many small riots that can happen almost every day or every other day, and we would not want a situation where every time there's some people complaining about lunch at their company and they go and strike, and that strike causes a CBI or a CBI to malbusiness. Now people can't come to malbusiness because people are rioting on the street, and those can happen very, very often. So it cannot be that then we would not want to offer like such cover. So then it's important that we at least exclude CBI and cover PI at the insured premises. And then, yes, it's important to sharpen the loss occurrence definition, right down to what perils particularly. So what part of what sort of strikes would you not like to cover? Would you not like to cover labor style strikes? Would you not like to cover riots that happen within companies? And so all of those, and then the hours clause also. So at what point is this an event? After how many hours does it stop being one event? And also it's important that we have a very well defined and well sharpened loss occurrence definition. And at the stage, that is all that I wanted to share as a background to strikes, riots, and civil commotions and terrorism. And these are the factors that I feel are so important to understand the risk that we are participating in, or the risk that we're facing, how it's changing, what it now is. Sorry, excuse me. What it now is, and the importance of having a forward outlook on it. So as part of my conclusion, I just want to touch quickly on pricing. So SICC and Terra, or PBT, like I said, as an industry, we have a very little appetite for it. And even though we have a little appetite for it, when we do offer it, it's very, very important that it is priced well. And some of the factors that we just need to take into account when we do price it is that the first point that I made, which is specifically defined perils. It's very, very important that we are not just offering PVT cover or even just terrorism cover, but we define exactly what we mean by this. Are we saying that we are giving sabotage cover, insurrection cover, So it's very important that we are more crystal in the way we define the perils that are being given. And yes, it's although this probably applies more on the reinsurance side, but it is important to get accurate exposure data. Historically, we have not been, but we're now moving towards being able to obtain this information. And yes, without accurate exposure data, it's almost impossible to price this, particularly also because what we think that what we have as historical losses is not even enough to price this, because we expect because of the different climate that we're in now, which is what I've tried to explain. Because of the different climate that we're in now, we expect different behavior going forward. So even the loss data going back is not as usable in terms of fitting our loss models to accurate exposure data. And as I mentioned this before, that sorry, I just got another message. I thought it was from Zoom. So it's also important that we pay a particular key focus on critical occupancies and those locations. We cannot be. It's important that we understand that the malls in SICC, for example, are bigger risk than office parks. It's important to understand that government buildings are not equally vulnerable to terrorism attacks than offices also, you know. So when we insure these risks, it's important that we understand exactly what occupancies are being insured here and where are these occupancies, because that speaks to a different probability of loss, and therefore it needs to be priced accordingly. Tariff leading to point number 4, which is that tariff rating is just generally not adequate. Previously, we've seen where there are some clients who just price all their commercial risks at a certain rate, all their domestic risks at a certain rate, all their motor risks at a certain rate, which then meant that all the risks were equally vulnerable, which is not the case. So it's very, very important that we pay particular attention again to their particular risk, occupancy, location, and all of those factors while we are doing our rating. And it's also very, very important that we do an in-depth qualitative analysis. So that's this is not an easy one. It's not easy. It's not always easy to understand what your political climate and how exposed you are to terrorism and how exposed you are to riots and strikes. But that is very, very, very important. It's important to at least do some analysis as to what terrorist groups could potentially hit your area, what economic factors may result in a strike, how does this community feel about the government. All of those factors that can cause a frustration that can result in an SICC, or a frustration that can result in groups carrying out a terrorism attack. So all of those factors need to be understood quite intensely. And this is the next one is my last slide, just giving a summary of everything that I was looking for. So a summary of this is that historically, PBT we viewed as sleep easy cover, and as such, even when priced in, it would attract a very, very low price. In fact, the terrorism pools that we've seen, their pricing has historically been so low that when a client is approached, well, in fact, in most times they don't even approach, But when a client sees the premium, the premium they pay for PVT on their overall portfolio, it's so small that it's negligible compared to the premium that you pay for the rest of your portfolio. But the reality that we're seeing going forward with this risk is that it's no longer sleep easy. We've seen events such as the one we encountered in South Africa in 2021, and we've seen other movements around the world that have now just become bigger and wider than they could have been historically. So because of that, we feel that this is not sleep easy cover anymore, and it needs some more consideration and more in-depth analysis and underwriting than it did in the past. And leading me to number 2, which is that it actually now requires the same risk assessment as traditional fire business. So historically, we've always just viewed this as, again, sleep easy. It's not a small premium because there are no losses expected from it. And I think that a lot of companies felt that it was, let's call it easy money, because they were not expecting to be paying losses from this exposure. But that era is gone. That era is gone. We have seen events of both Terra and SRCCC, and we've seen just how much it has changed. And at this point, we now need to be thinking about this exposure almost at the same level, not almost, in fact, because one could argue even more thorough than traditional fire business, because we understand traditional fire business, but this business we don't purely understand because of its unpredictability compared to the rest of our fire pool. And at this point, it's very important, again, linking to point 1 and 2, that we have a prospective outlook. What we saw, the losses that we've seen in the past, the frequency and severity, we feel that it does not completely depict what we can expect in the future, because we are moving to a time where, for example, now we're in a pandemic. Had there not been a pandemic when our ex-president in South Africa was incarcerated last year, in all likelihood, that event wouldn't have been big. In all likelihood, it would not have been an event. But now we live in different economic times. We live in, again, the keyword that I've been punting, we live in a time where we are an interconnected world. Right now, we're in the middle of a pandemic. So the losses that we've seen in the past happened in an era where we may not have had such challenges. And going forward, we may see losses bigger than what we've seen. So in our pricing, we need to just factor in the fact that we want to price with a perspective outlook, which is the world that we are moving towards. And I've said this before, that one of the key concerns with the PVT cover or the PVT exposure is that it is extremely unpredictable. Unlike we understand the rest of our fire exposure, the flex apparels, natural catastrophe apparel, that we're going to understand, and we have to some level we can predict the events. But with SRCC and terrorism, these events can almost happen at any given day, and we can never know. So we need to just proceed with caution when we offer this cover. And the last point, if we do offer this cover, we need to make sure that the pricing thereof is adequate. We need to ensure that we no longer take it as that sleep easy cover that we can offer at almost a negligible price, because the exposure is real, and we need to treat it as such, understand it as such, and price it as such. And on that will be the end of my presentation on it. I hope that you've gained a better understanding of this exposure than we did before. And I would like to open the floor to any questions you may have had during the presentation.
Sipho, there's a question that says, would you consider xenophobic attacks as direct PVT?
would we? Yes, yes, of course, definitely. So this is this is again one of the difficulties in this exposure, which is that when I said they're unpredictable, it takes it anything, absolutely anything. So these strikes can start from people being unhappy with their employer, being unhappy with service delivery from the municipality, right down to racial issues, right down to, again, xenophobic attacks. I mean, absolutely, absolutely. Right now in South Africa, we are going through something similar, although it's not, we have not seen, we have not incurred any losses for that matter, but there's a group that has started this Tutula, what they call themselves, Tutula movement, and it's a fairly xenophobic situation, or in fact, rather, it could arise into xenophobic conflicts. It is xenophobic conflicts, and losses that came from that would definitely be PVT, absolutely.
Okay, so the second question, if an insurance policy cover riots, strike, and civil commotion, does it cover acts of riots committed whereby rioters are against the government policies? In other words, in political riots, is political riots covered under normal SRCC, or it should be specifically covered under PVT?
So different policies, of course, will phrase this differently. But generally, from what we've seen, SRCC being part of PVT would be, generally from what you've seen, it covers political and non-political rights and strikes. But there are, I have at least seen a policy that did not, that was just on that was only covering non-political rights. But definitely, for the most part, if I mean, the labor disturbances, we've seen labor disturbances in South Africa, at least, where a group of people would be rioting against a certain municipality, which is the government, right? And no, not that labor, sorry. No, I didn't say labor. Service delivery strikes. So those would be riots against certain municipalities / the government, and it's political, if you like, right? And they're definitely covered by or SASRA, our instance, our terrorism pool that covers that.
All right, thanks, Sipho. Moving on to the next question. How are the Middle East countries responding to PVT products?
So in the Middle East, in the Middle East, they do, in fact, okay, no, I almost said to also Paul. In the Middle East, they do cover PVT to a large extent, rights, both from a rights strikes and from a terrorism perspective. And what they do there is that they would have, from a reinsurance perspective at least, they would have specialist treaties that are focused on those only. So they would not put them in their fire portfolio. So they would exclude them from traditional fire business, and then they would insure and reinsure them separately.
All right. And then we have the next question. The question is just on our Munich Re appetite for PVT in Cote d'Ivoire and Cameroon market.
Cote d'Ivoire and Cameroon market. Yes. Okay. So within, I wasn't expecting to answer questions about Munich Re, but it's okay. So in Munich Re, so what we do, the way we underwrite PVT in general is that we have a similar map of the world to what Klaus had shown you on natural catastrophes. So such a map, for example, on the natural catastrophe fund, we would have hail, and that will show you like the world, or how the different areas in the world are exposed to hail, to earthquakes, and then so we have one for terrorism and other PVT perils, right? And how we then do the map is with SICC and PVT, we rank the countries or the areas into three. So there are stable countries, medium stable countries, and unstable countries, which would be green, amber, and red. And the DRC and South Africa, by the way, we rank them as unstable on this panel.
All right, and there's also a question about maybe just clarity on the proper wording for aftershocks. Relating to that, there's also a question about what is covered under aftershocks. So there's a comment and the question. So let me just read out the comment. Very interesting topic. The importance of being specific when defining the actual type of peril under both PVT and SRCC. What is covered under aftershocks?
Okay, so when I spoke about aftershock, so an aftershock is just an aftershock as in the instance of natural catastrophes like an earthquake too, really. And what's important to understand with that statement that I made, by the way, is that it's not so much that there is such a thing as aftershock cover. So there's no policy or reinsurance treaty that would offer aftershock cover. However, in the standard cover, an aftershock would be covered too. So in the traditional policy or traditional treaty, when there's been an SICC event like we had last year in South Africa, or so any other event. Now, when so an aftershock is just other events that happen following that we may think are related to that. That's really that. There's no, it's an aftershock as you may have in the instance of an earthquake. You have one earthquake, one big earthquake, and then you have a smaller earthquake following that, maybe within months or a year following that. That's the aftershock. Now, even in natural catastrophes, it would not be excluded. It's standard for it not to be excluded. But what we're saying is that we are seeing those things happening, and because of that, we need to just be mindful that we say that then in our policy or in our treaty, subsequent events that follow after one event has occurred will not be covered, and that can be done in many ways. So it could be that you offer the policy or treaty to cover one event a year. So if, for example, the policy or the treaty specifically said that it's only going to cover one event in a year, then what that means that should there be an aftershock, another event that follows that, then it will not be covered. Or it could be maybe that's one event in 6 months. So then should there be an aftershock or another event that happens following that, it will not be covered. And that's then the way you can go around them. But other than that, it's standard for them to be covered. But we're saying that we now, and it's being standard for them to be covered, we're not viewing them as aftershocks, we're viewing them as historically, that is, we're viewing them as independent events. But the point I was making there was like, it's important for us to understand that they actually are related. So when there's been, generally when there's been a big strike, there's a likelihood of other smaller ones, usually other smaller ones following that. And we don't want to cover those. Or we're saying that it's perhaps prudent to then not cover those, because then if you think about it, they just compound to the bigger loss that you would have incurred from the first month.
Thanks, Sipho. There's also just a comment that I'm going to read out. The definition of SRCC and PV need more clarification to waive any misunderstanding in case of claims. And there's also a last question, says, is there a scenario by location where even with a special treaty PVT cover can't be I'm assuming can be given or gotten.
So they're asking if we have examples where we've excluded certain locations. Yes.
Yes.
So yeah, no, yes. For example, we have given this cover to some treaties in Nigeria, but then we would exclude, for example, the northern part where the Boko Haram usually is. And so if there are losses that arise from that part, the north and the west, then we would not cover them, because we know that those areas are more prone to these attacks than the rest of the country. So yes, absolutely.
Okay, there's also another question that just came in. So it's about Munich Re's position to real terrorism risk in Mozambique. Recently, we saw a mega total energies project being abandoned due to terror. Any variation, modification to terrorism risk in high risky areas as compared to less risky areas?
Can you read it again, if you don't mind, can you read the question again?
All
Sorry.
right.
I'm not sure I understood all
Okay.
of it today.
All right. So it says, I am curious to know about Munich Re's position to real terrorism risk in Mozambique. Recently, we saw a mega total energy project being abandoned due to terror. Any variation or modification to terrorism risk in high risk areas as compared to less risk areas?
So again, that speaks to the other point that I've made. Let me just check this. So that speaks to the other point that I've made, that we, as Munich Re, we have a similar map to the national catastrophe map that Klaus has shown you, and from that map, then the different areas all around the world, we don't deem them as equally vulnerable to terrorism, right? So I understand the abandonment of this project because of it, if I understand correctly, of it being a high risk area, because it simply means that then the insurers the insurers expected that this is very, very likely to a terrorism event than others. And on that basis, that's the underwriting that I'm trying to advocate, that it's important that when we know that the exposure in these occupancies and in these areas is that high, and perhaps we should just be cautious and not issue the cover in those instances. And even in our prices when we have, it's important that we price them adequately. In fact, the other thing with PVT, because it's such a, we see it as a high severity, low frequency exposure, the pricing is actually even less important than the risk selection. The risk selection, which is ensuring that we are we're not in the very highly exposed occupancies and highly exposed locations. That's actually even more important than the pricing, because from those we can suffer some really, really, really large losses.
Okay, thanks, Sipo. And another question, it's just to know what's your take on the ongoing Ukraine invasion from the reinsurance perspective?
So from an reinsurance perspective, there are two things at play, of course. One is damage to property because of the war. And as I said in the beginning, that war is a standard exclusion in our policies. So from that perspective, we do not expect any losses. We would not have, as an industry, we are not expecting losses from that, except for the specialist underwriters and specialist syndicates in London. So those would perhaps be impacted, but that's very, very, very small. That's very, very, very niche. but the rest of the industry should not suffer any losses from that perspective. The only other side where we are impacted, however, is then obviously then there's issues such as the sanctions. Does your treaty or policy have an adequate sanctions clause that will cover you against business from the part of the world or losses from the part of the world? And then obviously then the economic impact, right? The economic impact, the impact on the economy. So we're seeing inflation. Well, inflation is going to skyrocket. We're seeing, and that has a direct impact on the industry in the sense that now the price of claims, the cost of claims, cost of repairs, cost of settling claims will now increase. So from that perspective, from an economic perspective, we expect to suffer as an industry. And we just need to, again, from a wording perspective, we need to ensure that we have an adequate sanctions clause in our treaties and policies that covers us against exposure from entities linked with that part of the world. And but other than that, we don't expect the industry to pay any property losses from the war itself.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Sipho. That's all the questions we had from the chat box. But if anyone has a question, they can still raise their hand and unmute their mics and ask their question. But that's all the questions we had. All right, I don't see any questions coming in. So thanks, Sipho.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Sipho, thank you so much for your awesome presentation. This is Chipo, your namesake, speaking from Harare.
Oh.
And I'm part of the OSI team. We would really like to, on behalf of OSI, thank you so much for coming through and giving us that awesome presentation. And we will be sharing Sipho's presentation to everybody via email. At the moment, I am told that we are going to be sharing a video on the recently held OSI Golf Day in Harare. For all the delegates who are joining us today, if your company has got areas that where you got great speakers who would like to in this, right? Can you in touch with us so that we can do onto our speakers list? So as we go forward, we can always thank you for any speaking opportunity and for the topics that you are an expert or your organization is an expert at. So thank you very much to Sipho, and thank you to all the participants who are joining us today. We have got our last session for the Reinsurance Forum tomorrow, which is going to start at 9 a.m. Southern Africa time, or 10 a.m. with Eastern Africa time. So please, can you join us? Make sure that you log in a bit early so that we can allow everybody to come through that session tomorrow.